Welcome, everyone. My name is Ahmed. I'm delighted to be in conversation once again with the one and only, the fantastic Rami Khouri. Rami Khouri is a Palestinian-American academic and journalist whose family resides in Beirut, Amman, and Nazareth. During his 50-year career in journalism, he was managing editor of the Jordan Times and the Daily Star Beirut newspapers, and contributed reporting and opinion pieces from the Middle East to the Financial Times, NPR, BBC Radio, and other outlets. He founded and managed the Issam Faris Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs, IFI, at the American University of Beirut. He has been a Harvard Nieman Journalism Fellow and Senior Fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School and a Fellow of the Palestinian Academic Society for the Study of International Affairs in Arab East Jerusalem. He is currently a Distinguished Fellow at IFI, a Senior Fellow at the Arab Center, Washington, D.C., a regular contributor to Al Jazeera Online, and a member of the Just World Education Board. Welcome, Rami.
Thank you, Ahmed. Glad to be with you again. Keep up your good work.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. I want to delve quickly into the conversation. I know your time is limited. So recently we heard a number of countries in the Western realm planning to recognize Palestine at the UN. What does it mean for the Palestinians? And also how significant it is for the Palestinians that some of those major Western countries, like this country that I live in, Australia, France, the UK, what does it mean for them to intend to recognize the state of Palestine this month? Is it going to help, stopping the genocide and the likes?
Well, it's a good thing in principle for states to recognize Palestine, but it's a symbolic move. And I fear that they do this more to assuage their own guilt about not doing anything about the genocide and not having recognized Palestine 2 or 3 or 4 decades ago when they should have, if they really are serious about it. So, I'd rather have them recognize Palestine than not recognize it, but I don't think it has any significant positive impact. And in fact, it could be a negative force in the sense that, in my view, it is an element in the new form of colonialism that these Western powers, especially the European ones, are perpetrating, in the sense that it looks like a good thing to recognize the Palestinian state, but in fact, it just covers up the fact that they do nothing about all the terrible things that have happened to the Palestinians by the Israelis and with American and often European support, not just in the last 2 years of the genocide, but in the last 40, 50 years in the Middle East. So it's a gesture that is largely hollow, but looks good. I'd still say rather have it than not have it, but I don't expect anything to come out of it. If they really are serious about recognizing Palestinian rights, they have to be more active in doing whatever they can, which is a lot, to stop the Israeli criminal and barbarian actions now that are taking place, not just in Gaza, but also increasingly in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. So let's hope that the Arab world and others react by pushing these countries to do more than just issue a paper acknowledgement that the Palestinians should have a state. I mean, the Palestinian right to a state is deeply anchored in dozens of UN resolutions, many of which these countries voted for. So that's not a big deal in itself. What we need now is serious action by Western powers to show that they genuinely mean what they say. When they say the Palestinians should have a state, it means the Israelis should be contained and constrained in their continued apartheid and occupation and now even genocidal policies. And there's a dozen things that they could do, or embargoes or sanctions or whatever, or doing the kinds of things that many of the West did against apartheid South Africa to stop it from living a normal life because it was acting in an abnormal criminal way against its enemies. In the South African case, it was the indigenous Black South Africans. In the Palestinian-Israeli case, it's the Palestinian people. And not only that, but these are countries that often, the countries today that say they're going to recognize a Palestinian state, these are the same countries that often make it a crime to support the Palestinian people's rights in their own countries. In Great Britain or the United States, you can lose your job, you can be taken to court, you can be arrested for supporting a peaceful gesture of expression of your support for the rights of the Palestinians to statehood and your opposition to the criminal acts that the Israelis are doing. So if you look at what actual policy is by these countries and put that against their actual statement that the Palestinians should have a state, this is a clarification that these are not serious gestures by these. They're not sincere, they're not serious, they're not productive, and they really, we should call them out on this and push them to make the statement, make the recognition, but go well beyond that with more practical actions that show us that they're actually serious. Because when you look at the region today in the whole Middle East and Palestine especially, and you look at the Western countries, many of them, what they've done, some of the Western countries are very good, like Spain and Ireland and others, but most of them are not. And they just talk nicely, but they support criminal apartheid genocidal policies. And the reality is that the Western world has always done this for the last century of the conflict between Zionism and Arabism in Palestine, which became the conflict between the state of Israel and the Arab states. This has been a continuous policy by most of the Western world to actually support what the Israelis are doing, partly because of the genocide, partly because of other reasons, but I think partly because these at heart are colonial countries. They don't believe that the indigenous people of Palestine or many other parts of the world actually have the same rights as the white colonial people. They are deep in their genes, their political genes, their colonial countries. And this is the last active colonial struggle in the world. And when they're pushed to show us where they stand, they show the Western countries show that they actually stand more with the Israeli settler colonial apartheid racist genocidal system than they do with the Palestinian rights, which they only recognize in words. So all of this talk that we've heard from the West, from most of the Western world, again, some of them have been very good, but most of the Western world that for the last half a century, for my whole 60 years of journalism and public policy work in the Middle East, all of these countries have talked about democracy and human rights and peaceful resolution of conflict and all of these things. And it now becomes clear that this was a hoax. This was not serious. This was not sincere. This was just a public relations stunt, and they've continued it in most cases. And it was not only due to the Israeli impact of the public relations that Israel did and the pressure that Israel put on the political systems in the West. It was also due to their inner core colonial identity. And this has to end. And that's why the whole world is supporting the Palestinians virtually, and many people in the Western world now, which is a really significant new development, you have majorities in most Western countries that want an immediate ceasefire, a negotiated permanent resolution of the conflict. And the governments don't follow the sentiments of their own people. So that's a long answer to a short, clear question. So we welcome the recognition of the Palestinian state. We don't welcome the continuation of Western colonial policies that are totally unimpacted by this recognition. So they have to go further.
Absolutely. I mean, there's some sort of like a colonial patronizing sentiment as well to that kind of recognition. Like we will recognize, like the UK, for example, Keir Starmer, we will recognize Palestine if Israel doesn't stop the genocide, or the French, we recognize the Palestinian demilitarized or something like that. So it's all that colonial conditioning to that sentiment.
That's right. And this is just another way for them to show that they don't really believe that the Palestinians and the Israelis are both people who are endowed by God and by constitutionalism and by modern liberal political values, are both endowed with equal rights. And those equal rights need to be implemented simultaneously, not sequentially. The process for the last 50, 60 years has been that if the Palestinians and the Arabs are nice to the Israelis and treat them well and give them what they want, then maybe the Palestinians and the Arabs will get some of their rights. And this is just another form of colonialism. So we're really at a very important moment in modern world history that will clarify exactly what these Western so-called liberal countries, what they really stand for. And of course, you see more and more of them adopting right-wing fascist policies, including the United States, where I am now. So this is a critical moment, but let's build on that. If they come up with these recognitions of Palestinian state, then let's push them to build on them and expose their colonial contradictions and insincerities and force them to stop being colonial and start being reasonable and equitable, and they would be embraced with open arms all over the world.
Couldn't agree more. I mean, talking about recognition of the state of Palestine and the non-recognition of what's actually happening on the ground in Gaza, as the sentiment of genocide. Like we have a growing number of experts, international, non-governmental institutions, human rights institutions, Amnesty, Human Rights Watch. The UN recently came out with a report saying that Israel indeed is committing a genocide. We had this press conference with Chris Sidoti, who's an Australian as well. So how significant is the recent voting of the International Association of Genocide Scholars voting that Israel is committing a genocide in Gaza? Also, how significant is the UN report, the recent one, I think it was a couple of days ago, accusing Israel of a crime of genocide? Is that going to change anything on the ground eventually, long term or short term?
These kind of moves could very well eventually change things on the ground. And in fact, that's how serious change has happened throughout history, for certainly modern history, is that people mobilize, people organize, people protest, people do political activism and lobbying and whatever, and they educate their publics, and they show people that the current policies they're pursuing are wrong, are hurtful, and maybe even criminal in terms of violating international law. So my experience over these 6 decades that I've been involved in journalism and public affairs certainly has taught me over and over again, starting in the 1960s when I was at university in the United States with the anti-war protests, anti-Vietnam War protests, and then the early years of the women's rights movements, or not the women's rights movement started before that, but the early new stage of the women's rights, equal rights movements, and the civil rights movement stage in the 60s and 70s, and the environmental movement. These four big forces all were very vibrant in the 1960s when I was in college and early 70s, and I watched it. And I was involved in some of these street protests and journalism and stuff. And it's very clear that change did happen. So the United States did eventually pull out of Vietnam. Laws were passed to make civil rights more equal for blacks and whites and others. Women's rights were improved, and environmental protection measures were taken eventually, but it took years, sometimes decades, for these sentiments to get into the public policy making process, meaning mainly the parliament, the governments, the executive branches and the parliaments had to pass these laws. So it takes a long time. You saw this in the anti-apartheid movement against South Africa as well. It took a long time for the world to finally push South Africa to end apartheid. And the United States and Great Britain were among the last countries to do this, because they're the two big colonial powers of the last century, the British in the first part of the last century, and the Americans after the 1950s became the dominant Western colonial power. And it's no surprise that they were among the last to go against apartheid by South Africa, and have been among the most fervent supporters of Israeli apartheid and racism and now genocide. So the decisions you mentioned, the Genocide Scholars Association, Holocaust and Genocide Scholars, and the reports by the UN and others, these are very significant because, first of all, they're the work of very serious people. They're not the work of small, left-wing or right-wing groups or whatever. These are serious professionals whose names and reputations are on the line. And when they issue this kind of report, you can be sure that it's based on significant factual evidence. And I know some of there's a couple of people I know, American Israeli scholars here in the US, who are part of the genocide and Holocaust studies world, and very respected ones. And they don't issue these statements lightly. And they told me that one of the reasons the statement by the Holocaust Scholarly Studies Association is important is because this group is a kind of conservative group. They're very quiet. They don't normally make this kind of public statement. So for them to come out and say this, even though not all their members voted, but that's irrelevant. Most people don't vote in national elections, but the result is the same. So the fact is that the association issued this statement in its name based on a vote of its members who voted. And for them to say this really should open our eyes. And the significant thing about that statement was it's linking what's going on now with previous moves by Israel, that this is not just something that started recently. This has been going on for mistreatment of Palestinians by Zionists and Israelis and their Western supporters has been going on for many decades. And similarly with the UN report, there's been many reports by UN agencies, by independent NGOs, Israeli groups, Arab groups, European groups. Many groups have come out and looked at what's been going on in Gaza, said this is genocide. And it's easy to reach that conclusion because the Genocide Convention of 1952, I think it was, has spelled out criteria. I think there's 5 or 6 specific criteria. And every group that studies this situation in Palestine and Gaza today looks at these criteria and says, yeah, check, check, check. This is what genocide is. And therefore they have to conclude that what the Israelis are doing is genocide. And this will have an impact more and more. The main area where this is having an impact up to now, I believe, has been among Jews around the world, especially in the United States and in parts of Europe. Jewish groups have responded much more vibrantly to this stream of analysis by respected scholars and groups of scholars who have looked at Israel's actions certify that it is genocide, certify that it is unacceptable and must be stopped. And the Jews who do this are usually motivated by the fact that they are going to feel some of the backlash. As Jews in foreign countries, many people are going to say, well, look, this is what your people are doing. And the Jews who oppose Israel's policy are saying, yes, we're all Jews, but we're not all Zionist, militant, extremist, racist, apartheid-loving, genocidal militants, as the current Israeli government is. And this is a really significant development. And you're starting to see serious differences among Jewish populations, certainly in the United States, but also in other Western countries. You're also seeing this polarization in other critical groups, for instance, evangelical groups, some of the Republican groups, some of the MAGA supporters of Trump. In all of these groups, studies in the last month or two have shown that more and more people are breaking away from the former majority view amongst their members that Israel's not doing genocide and defending itself, and we have to support them. And they're breaking away from that and basically saying, no, they are doing genocide, and we can't accept this as Jews or as human beings or citizens of whatever country they're citizens of. So these are significant, but they're stops on the way to eventually getting policy changes from Western governments and ultimately from the United States and Israel, which are the two that count the most. The difficulty in this kind of situation is that the Israelis and the Americans don't care about these kind of statements or studies or conclusions, even by the most respected people. They don't care because colonialism isn't based on the acceptance of the views of all people. Colonialism is based on the idea that a small white minority has the total right to do whatever it wants, and there are dark-skinned people, people of color, and they have no rights, and we can kill them, we can put them in concentration camps, we can expel them, we can torture them, we can put them in prison, we can starve them to death as we're doing now. And this is one of the dilemmas, that the U.S. and Israeli governments don't care about these statements, whereas the majority of the people of the Western countries and more in Israel, and certainly among Jews around the world, they do care. So we will. This is a good thing to keep doing. People need to keep repeating. Yet this is genocide. These are new ways to kill babies. The number of ways in which the Israelis have killed babies is astounding, and somebody will eventually come out with a study. UNICEF has done several studies about children, but it's the killing of babies that to me is the most grotesque expression of Zionist and Israeli government genocidal atrocities and their inhumanity. And they keep finding new ways to kill babies. The newest is to starve them to death. They also burn them to death, and they shred them with these quadcopters, these drones that send out little like little knives, and babies are shredded. And you see pictures of them. They're all over social media. But now their starvation seems to be the newest method, and continually with the bombing that's going on, especially in Gaza City.
Absolutely. I mean, we did interviews with doctors from Nasser Hospital as well, from Shahid Al-Aqsa Hospital and Shifa. It's just devastating, the kind of weaponry that the IOF is using against those children and civilians. And we also in Australia have this witch hunt, new McCarthyism against all these people who are critical of Israel, critical of genocide, anti-genocide movement. And it's interesting, I always say it is actually anti-Semitic not to criticize Israel for what it's doing, talking about the Jewish community's reflection. This is a country that is speaking on behalf of the entire population of the Jewish people in the world, is committing a genocide. It's actually anti-Semitic not to criticize what they're doing, if you think of it
Right.
that way. It's
Yeah,
just,
yeah,
yeah.
absolutely.
So, I mean, unfortunately, we see the Israeli society, journalists like Orly Noy the other day published in plus 972, I think, platform comparing what they're doing in Gaza to what the Nazis did during the Holocaust. And yet, in the Western media, we still can't even say the word genocide when it comes to Israel. Like, I'm really keen to get your reflection on this.
Well, this is changing slowly, but very slowly. It's another example of how policies change, not just the policies of governments, the policies of media, policies of universities, corporations, all of which are involved in the colonial structures that mistreat indigenous people and promote the apartheid and racist policies of the governing settler colonial minority. And this is starting to change. So in the US now, people are speaking out about genocide openly in the media much more. You're getting people in the media, and I'm talking about mainstream media like, national television stations, CNN, people like that who the host of a TV show will be talking to one or two people who are pro or Israel or critical of Israel. And when the pro-Israel people start issuing their usual propagandist rhetoric and public relations terms, which for a century have successfully conditioned the American public to believe that Israel is great and right and moral and righteous, and the Palestinians are evil and violent and criminal and anti-Semitic. But the host will then stop the pro-Israeli speaker and say, look, stop giving me this Israeli propaganda. I want to talk about what's going on in Gaza or in Rafah or in whatever. This is new. And you get studies now of contentious issues like attacking a hospital or the killing of journalists. Now, American institutions, media institutions, serious major ones, are doing their own studies. They don't take the Israeli lies like they used to and pass them on. They do their own studies and they come out with reports that saying, well, the Israelis did kill this person or did shoot these journalists or did attack this hospital with no evidence of Hamas role or anything there. So these are all important signs of the slow incremental change that has been happening. And the important thing is it's happening in almost all sectors of society. And it's happening at a faster and faster pace. Eventually, it will, and this is part of what's leading to the change in public opinion, which you see in the polling evidence. And eventually, this will impact political leaders. When the political class realizes that supporting Israel's genocidal policies will hurt their chances of being reelected in the US or England or Germany or wherever, when they make that realization, they will change their policies. Because most Western politicians are unprincipled, you know, what's the proper term? I don't want to insult them too much, but they're unprincipled deal makers. They just want to make a deal for their own benefit, to stay in power and to exercise power. They don't have, most of them don't have consistent ethical foundations. Most of them don't have clear moral political strategies. They respond to which way the wind is blowing, and they take a position accordingly. If they see that the majority of their own people and their voters are going to vote against them, they will change their policies. And this is already happening. You can see it slowly in the Congress of the United States, the number of people, especially Democrats, who are openly calling for a ceasefire, permanent peace agreement, recognition of Palestinian state, full humanitarian aid. These numbers are growing slowly, slowly, slowly. And that's the best we can hope for. They're not going to change overnight.
We could only hope for that outcome very soon. I want to change gears a little bit. Now that the majority of the world is acknowledging that Israel is committing a genocide in Gaza, the genocide is in the background leaking into the West Bank. Israel is bombing southern Lebanon. Israel has been bombing Syria as well. Israel has recently bombed Iran, has recently bombed the flotilla in Tunisia, and recently with the bombing of Doha, it was a huge surprise to many in the Arab world and internationally as well. I mean, so one can't help but wondering what's next. So, what's your reflection on bombing the Hamas delegation in Doha, in Qatar, in a sovereign country, sovereign Arab country?
Yeah. Yes, and in your list, you didn't mention Yemen. They've been bombing Yemen all nonstop, as have the Americans and the British too. Um, so the situation around the Israeli, it was an Israeli-American attack. The Israelis planned it and did it, but the Americans knew about it and provided logistical, direct or indirect support, because the Americans control all that airspace, not just out of the base in Qatar and the Udeid Air Base in Qatar, but in other areas as well. And the British, of course, from Cyprus and other places. The Americans have total knowledge of everything flying in the sky that has an engine in it. They absolutely knew what was going on, and they didn't alert the Qataris, and they didn't push the Israelis to stop it. So we have to speak of an American-assisted, American-enabled Israeli attack. I think the main consequence of this is going to be it started already, the ongoing rethinking by all the Arab countries, rethinking their security and political and economic and technological relationships with the United States in particular, but also other Western powers, but mainly the United States in this case. The Arab countries can't just suddenly turn against the United States. They've spent the last 50 years getting assistance from the US, trying to be friends with the US, trying to cajole it into political action to help the region develop and be peaceful and be prosperous, etc. They can't just suddenly turn against the US, and they don't want to turn against the US. I don't want the Arab countries all to become enemies of the US. The United States is the most powerful country in the world in many ways, the wealthiest in many ways. It'll probably stay that way for quite a while. Despite the terrible things it does, there are advantages to being on good terms with the United States and the Europeans and all the other Western countries. But at the same time, the Arab countries have a real deep structural problem, which is they've spent the last 40, 50 years developing closer ties, military ties, economic ties, aid, whatever, and they're extremely vulnerable to any kind of pressures from the United States. And what really has happened is that the Arab countries have essentially reduced their sovereignty. They haven't forfeited all their sovereignty, but they've diminished their sovereignty. There are areas where some Arab countries, and I won't mention them just out of courtesy, but some Arab countries depend on the US just to get enough money to pay their troops and their bureaucrats, to get food, to get water, to run their armies, to do fundamental things of statehood. And these Arab governments that are so reliant on the US can't do any of this on their own. If they suddenly turn against the US will turn off the faucet, and these countries will collapse unless somebody else comes to help them out. So we have a real moment of reckoning here, which is that the majority of Arab countries, including some of the oil-producing wealthy small ones, the majority of Arab countries have not passed the full tests of statehood, citizenship, and sovereignty. Their citizens don't have real rights. The states are not stable and productive and producing good things for all their citizens. And they don't have real sovereignty. Most Arab countries can't take a major decision like trade policies or military purchases without getting the approval of some foreign patron. That used to be the British and the French years ago. Then the Americans became the dominant ones. But there's other ones now. Turkey, Iran, Russia, China possibly in the future, maybe India one day. So already we see other foreign countries, and Israel to some extent has to approve certain things. For instance, if Arab countries want to buy certain defense equipment from the US, the Israelis have to approve it because the US is committed in an act of Congress to keep all the foes of Israel, all the real or potential foes, enemies of Israel, weaker than the state of Israel itself, militarily. And this is a policy that the US has implemented, which is one reason why the Israelis do whatever they want militarily around the region, because the US totally supports them in this. And therefore, even in military terms, some Arab countries are now relying on Israel for surveillance equipment and certain strategic items. And this is something that the majority of Arab people are against. But the Arab people don't have rights. They don't have voice. They don't have agency. They don't have the ability to shape the policies of their own governments, which is one of the reasons why these governments have become so weak and vulnerable, because they rely on foreign support more than the convictions and support and validation of their own people. We don't have a single Arab country, not a single one, despite the fact that many Arab countries have done so many good things, and I have a lot of respect for many of them. But we don't have a single Arab country that has been validated by its own citizens, that they created the borders, they wrote the constitution, they shaped the policies, and they held the government and public sector and private sector, held them accountable. Not a single Arab country does this. And this is why we're in such terrible shape. So this is really a moment when the Arab world is totally shocked by what happened with the Israeli-American-supported attack on Qatar. The Arab world is shocked by this, but can't do anything about it. And that's why when they met with the Islamic countries and had a summit, they came up with some statements that were fascinating, but pretty meaningless because they had no real action behind them. And this is a very difficult moment for the Arab countries because it shows their total helplessness in front of the two main threats that they face, which are the United States and Israel. And these two threats are the ones that are named regularly in public opinion polls across the whole Arab world. When Arab people are asked, who do you see as your main security threats? Always Israel and the US are the first ones that ordinary citizens name. Others are named like Iran, like Russia, like others, but it's Israel and the US that are seen as the big threats by Arab people. And of course, the governments of the Arab countries more or less ignore their own people. And that's why we have this terrible situation. So how this plays itself out, we don't know. Arab countries are certainly starting a process of expanding their strategic links with other people around the world. Obviously, the Europeans a bit, the Russians, the Chinese, the Indians, Iranians, Turks, others, they're expanding their strategic links so they have less vulnerability to their disproportionate relations with and reliance on the United States. This is a slow process. It takes decades for these kinds of things to happen, but it's starting to happen now.
Thanks for listening to my conversation with Rami Khouri. Unfortunately, towards the end of his answer to that last question, the connection was lost, and so we had to end the conversation at that. Thanks again for watching, and stay tuned for future webinars and online conversation. Until we meet again next time, stay safe and keep talking about Palestine.